The English professor came down from his school. He hitched a ride in an hour.
I first met David Amram in Austin in 1971. He had come to play his triple concerto for woodwind, brass, and jazz quintets with the Austin Symphony. We shared the stage one evening as I played horn in the woodwind quintet and looked 10 feet away to see him improvising on the horn. I was fascinated, almost starstruck. Over the years since, I have done what I can to keep in touch with David, no longer starstruck, rather simply thankful for his infectious enthusiasm for music and friendship built upon love for the creative spirit. I have had the good fortune of crossing paths with David a few years ago at the Woody Guthrie Festival in Okemah, Oklahoma, a number of times at the Kerrville Folk Festival, and at a busy concourse at the San Antonio International Airport in 1999. The first time I interviewed David. I most recently recorded more of David's stories at this year's Kerrville Folk Festival, this year marking 50 years of the festival and unofficially marking David's turn into his 90s. He's now 91, going on 92. Some years ago, I heard Bobby Bridger talk about his first encounter with David and how he promoted David to Kerrville Folk Festival founder Rod Kennedy. I thought I would get Bobby to tell the story again. Thankfully, he agreed only 20 minutes after telling an audience that he had spent much of the past year battling a diagnosis of throat cancer. He beat it, and that night at the festival was returning to public performance for an appreciative crowd which cheered his recovery and his live set. Bobby's story of David Amram and how he promoted David to the festival begins in New York City. Oh yeah, we started at a partially abandoned campsite behind the main stage at the festival as night fell. Bobby's story begins in darkness, illuminated a minute or so in by the flashlight app on my phone.
Well, I was in New York with the noted Dakota philosopher author Vine Deloria Jr., who wrote "Custer Died for Your Sins" and "Behind the Trail of Broken Treaties" and "God is Red" and 30 other books. And he hadn't written those books at the time. He was still a young man. And I was 31, I think. And Vine had heard the original recording of Seekers of the Fleece in the studio the night we finished it. And so he vowed to help me with it. And we'd had a meeting in New York with the Ford Foundation and several publishers to try to hook up a deal for Seekers of the Fleece to be recorded and are released by a distributor. And Vine would hang out at a very famous bar, writer's bar in the village called the Lion's Head. And God, all the noted authors of the from the 50s forward hung out and drank themselves silly in the Lion's Head bar. Jessica Lynch was a waitress there then, the famous actress. That'll tell you how long ago this was. 76. Anyway, she was about to break out. And frankly, I got bored there, and Vine saw that, and he went and called David Amram, his friend. Said, "Come down here and help me out. I've got this musician from Texas, and he's kind of getting bored listening to all us writers drink ourselves silly." And he said, "Why don't you come down and you guys play some songs?" And David came down to the Lion's Head. I had no idea who David Amram was. I had no knowledge of him. And he hung out with us there for a couple hours, and we chatted with all the writers and people. Anyway, David said, "Let's get out of here. I've got an apartment real close to here. We can go to my place and play music." And it was already about 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock. And so I went to David's apartment with him, and I still knew nothing about him, and we played music all night basically, till about 3 or 4. And I said, you know, I'm a part of this festival down in Texas called the Kerrville Folk Festival, and I think you'd really love it. You ought to come down sometime. And he said, oh, I would love to do that. He said, let me get some materials for you. And he went to his library and he started pulling out books, his autobiography, and all these awards from Billboard and Cashbox and Opera magazine, all sorts of stuff. And by the time I got in a cab, I was looking through these things and I thought, geez, this guy's, he's unreal. He's got credits. I've never seen credits like this. So I came back to Texas and I called Rod Kennedy to honor my promise to David. And Rod was, you know David Amram. Rod was blown away because he had a classical music station in Austin and he knew who David Amram was. He said, you bet. So he booked David, and David came down in May of '76 and was a huge hit. Everybody just adored him. It was wonderful. It was just a match made in heaven, David and Kerrville. And then a year went by, and about April of '77, David called me up, nearly in tears. Rod won't book me again this year. What can you do? And I said, what? He said, no. He said, he's got some sort of rule, stipulation that you can't come back 2 years in a row, and I didn't make it, so I'm not coming back. And so I called Rod up and went over to his office and met him. And we proceeded to enter into a very, very heated argument, nearly a fight over David. And in the middle of it, Rod just stopped the heated words and said, would you like to become a director of the Kerrville Folk Festival? And I was so flustered, I just said, Rod, we're not talking about that. And then I said, besides, what does a director do at the board of directors of the festival? And he said, well, you get to bring a guest every year. And I said, oh, so if I accept this offer, I can bring, he said, right, you can bring David as your guest. And so I said, well, I'll accept. And so that's how I got to be on the board of directors, which was basically a title. Rod was a dictator, as we all know. And that's how David came for a second year. And I invited him every year as my guest for a number of years after that. And we just got to be the best of pals, and I love him dearly and can't wait to work with him again tonight.
Yeah.
Does that cover it?
That covers it.